Hello, welcome to chapter 26, part 3. This is a super important lecture that I want you to take your time with because this is the lecture that talks about hormonal regulation of fluid balance. And remember, fluid balance pretty much transfers to blood volume, and blood volume affects blood pressure. So this is going to be an important lecture that talks about the hormones that help us maintain a safe level of blood pressure. We can't have too low of blood pressure, or we won't have enough pressure to deliver blood, oxygen, and nutrients to your brain. If your blood pressure gets too low, you'll faint. We call that syncope, so that your head is lying on the floor at the same level as your heart, and maybe gravity will help some fluid get to your brain. So low fluid volume is quickly and potentially deadly. Okay, so moving on, you're going to see this slide, this bright yellow slide in the lectures coming up. And what this is the slide of, it will tell you the hormones specifically that we are addressing in this chapter and in this lecture. So we're going to look at these hormones here: ADH, antidiuretic hormone; aldosterone; ANP, which is atrial natriuretic peptide; PTH, which is parathyroid hormone; and then this big super important mechanism called the renin angiotensin aldosterone system, which is a multi-organ system response to low blood pressure to raise it so that we can live. Okay, so fluid volume is tightly regulated by these hormones. Hormones belong in the endocrine system. We will cover that in chapter 16. Normally we would cover 16 before we get to chapter 26, but last semester I met with the nursing school asking what I could do to make my class better to serve my students. And they said, universally, nursing students are weak in blood volume homeostasis. And so I decided to move chapter 26 earlier in the semester so we can talk about it now, and then really talk about it in every system following, so that you are stronger and more confident in your understanding of this important concept and better prepared for your TEAS exam, better prepared for the first semester of nursing school. Okay, so we're going to see two sets of hormones here. Hormones that act on the kidneys, that change urine concentration, right? So we take the water out of urine and urine volume, and ultimately blood volume and blood pressure. So the kidney is the major player in fluid volume regulation, because the kidney has the ability to take water out of what would be your urine and move it from the urine back to the blood to raise blood volume and blood pressure. So hormones are going to act on the kidney, are going to affect movement of fluid out of urine into blood. And then we're going to look at hormones that affect the cardiovascular system, that act on the smooth muscle layer of the blood vessels. Remember, blood vessels are hollow organs, and one of the layers around the organ are smooth muscles, involuntary muscles, and hormones can act on those smooth muscles and cause them to constrict, which would decrease the size of the blood vessel, which would increase blood pressure without affecting blood volume. So that's a rather rapid action. And then we're going to look at urinary and cardiovascular system working together with the hormones with this system called renin angiotensin aldosterone system. Okay, so how do we measure blood volume? We're going to measure it by the pressure exerted against the blood vessel walls through baroreceptors. Remember, baro, it means pressure. So these are receptors that are going to be in your aorta, which is the vessel right outside of your heart, and in the carotid arteries going to your brain. Those vessels will be able to monitor the pressure of the blood coming out of the heart. And should they notice that the pressure is dropping, they can initiate a response to raise blood volume or blood pressure and stop that process. Chemoreceptors can monitor many kinds of chemicals, but the specific ones we're going to look at are chemoreceptors in the kidney that look at sodium concentration in the blood. So remember, the kidney's job is to filter blood. And so while it is filtering the blood, it can be monitoring the pressure of that blood coming and blood volume, and then it can initiate a response based on what it's noticing and if there's more sodium than there should be. Osmoreceptors measure the solutes dissolved in blood, not only sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, all of that. And when those solutes become concentrated, then the hypothalamus can trigger a response to increase blood volume and blood pressure. Remember, the hypothalamus is a region in your brain, and the hypothalamus is the master controller that talks between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it's going to be the major responder to changes and threats in homeostasis. Okay, and like I said, we're going to look at hormones again in chapter 16. But what I want you to learn are these three main hormones in this lecture: ADH, anti-diuretic hormone; aldosterone, ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. And then know how this renin-angiotensin aldosterone system works. All right, so here we go. ANP, this is the first hormone. It stands for atrial natriuretic peptide. I know that it is easier to skip over big words, but I want you to look at these big words for some context clues that will help you understand the job of this hormone. So atrial refers to atrium, which is the receiving chambers for blood in the heart. So this is going to be a hormone produced by the heart. You'll notice the heart has its main job in the cardiovascular system, but it is also an endocrine organ because it produces this one hormone. So this hormone is produced in the heart in response to high blood pressure or high blood volume. So this is the only hormone that we have that decreases blood volume and blood pressure. The other hormones are going to raise blood pressure and raise blood volume. So we have more hormones that raise blood pressure than lower blood pressure. So let's think about that. Why would that happen? Why would we need more hormones to raise blood pressure when you rarely hear people having a lot of high blood pressure, right? So hypertension, high blood pressure, has really only been a threat to humans in less than 100 years. But for the couple million years before that, humans were far more at risk of dying of low blood pressure from dehydration, from starvation, diarrhea, far more at risk for dying from low blood pressure than high blood pressure. So we have more mechanisms to raise blood pressure. Also, high blood pressure takes a long time to cause damage. You might have heard hypertension called the silent killer, and that's because it takes a decade or more of chronically uncontrolled high blood pressure to cause damage. But low blood pressure can kill you in a matter of minutes or days, depending on how low it is and what the cause of the low blood pressure is. So ANP is going to be produced in the heart in response to high blood pressure. It is the only hormone we have that lowers blood pressure. It is regulated, like most of the hormones that we're going to talk about today, by a negative feedback. So when, remember, homeostasis is here, right? So when blood pressure gets too high, ANP is going to come back and bring it back into balance like this. High blood pressure is dangerous because it can cause tissue damage, right? Imagine like a garden hose on super strong spray and spraying that at some tender plants or something like that. That would wash away the soil and damage the leaves of the plant, just like high blood pressure uncontrolled in your body will cause damage to your kidney, to your brain, to your heart, to your blood vessels, to your eyes. if it's not controlled. So the heart is going to protect itself if blood pressure is too high and release this hormone to lower blood pressure. All hormones will have a target organ. This is a specific organ or tissue that responds to the hormone, kind of like a lock and key systems. It's very specific. So AMP is going to travel through the blood to the kidney. And when it gets to the kidney, it's going to tell the kidney to reabsorb sodium. That's where this natrium right here in this word comes from. Remember NaCl, sodium chloride, natrium is the Na. So it's going to say, pull sodium from the urine back into the blood. If you remember osmosis, if we move the salt, the water will follow. So the kidney will reabsorb, excuse me, we're doing the opposite here. AMP will cause the kidney to excrete more sodium. So we're putting more sodium into the urine, making the urine saltier. And then the water will follow the sodium into the urine so that we will increase the urine volume. We're moving fluid from the blood to the urine. That will reduce the fluid volume, that will reduce blood pressure. So ANP ultimately lowers blood pressure. So look at that word again, atrial, that's where it's made, in the atrium of the heart. Natrium refers to salt, so it's going to move salt into the urine. Uretic is going to refer to the urinary system. So this is a hormone that moves salt into the urine to cause us to urinate more, to reduce blood volume and blood pressure. Okay, ADH is the next one, anti-diuretic hormone. To diurese is to lose fluid from the body. So this is a hormone that is going to conserve fluid and therefore increase fluid volume and increase blood pressure. This is a hormone produced by the hypothalamus, and it's actually so important. We have a little storage shed for it called the posterior pituitary gland. So it's made by the hypothalamus, regulated negative feedback by blood volume and blood pressure. So when blood volume or blood pressure drop, it's going to be secreted. It is going to be part of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So when we need to raise blood pressure, and it is regulated by solute concentration. Remember, the hypothalamus has those osmoreceptors, and when the blood becomes more concentrated with solute, like say you're sweating or losing water that way, then the hypothalamus will release this hormone. It is going to have the kidney as its target organ as well, and it will tell the kidney to reabsorb water only. So ADH has nothing to do with solutes like sodium. It's just telling the kidney reabsorb more water. So it kind of like puts more doorways in so that we can flow the water out of the urine back into the blood. So when the water goes into the blood, that increases blood volume increases blood pressure. So ADH will raise blood pressure. ADH has another target, the smooth muscles in the blood vessels. So ADH can also cause blood vessels to constrict. Then we have a smaller space, the same amount of volume, and that is going to increase blood pressure as well. So remember that ADH has two mechanisms of action to raise blood pressure. Aldosterone is our next hormone. It is a hormone produced by the outer layer of the adrenal cortex. The adrenal gland is a little gland that sits on top of the kidney, like a little triangle, like a little hat like this. And the outer layer of that adrenal gland is called the adrenal cortex. That is what makes aldosterone. The inner part, the adrenal medulla, is part of the nervous system. Aldosterone also functions to raise blood pressure. It is regulated by negative feedback of blood volume, blood pressure, and also through renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Its action also on the kidney. I like to use a little funny reminder, Al heart salt. Okay, so Al, being aldosterone, loves salt. So Al's job when aldosterone is released is to tell the kidney to reabsorb sodium from the urine. So moving sodium from the urine back into the blood. And then where sodium goes, water will go. When the water moves out of the urine, you're going to get dark urine, smaller volume, more concentrated urine. And then you're going to increase blood volume and blood pressure because that water moves from the urine back into the blood to increase blood volume and blood pressure. We will also see the kidney kind of swapping out the sodium and potassium for electrolyte balance. So when it reabsorbs sodium, it's going to secrete more potassium into the urine. Ultimately, aldosterone raises blood pressure. Okay, so now let's look at this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So this is a multi-organ, multi-step process that has kind of a primary pathway, a secondary pathway, and these backup pathways in order to maintain blood volume and blood pressure in levels to keep us alive. It's going to involve nervous, cardiovascular, endocrine, and urinary systems. Okay, so remember, blood pressure is monitored by baroreceptors. We talked about them in the arteries here in the neck and in the aorta, and the chemoreceptors in the kidney. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So when the kidney senses low blood pressure or low blood volume by elevated levels of sodium in the blood, right? So it's the chemoreceptors looking at sodium. So when it notices that sodium is elevated, it's going to think, oh, that's because we've lost blood volume, and it is going to release this enzyme renin. So it's important to know renin is not a hormone. Renin is an enzyme. So hormones are released by an organ, travel through the blood, act on another organ to do something. Enzymes jumpstart reactions. So that's what renin is going to do. When the kidney notices that blood pressure is dropping, it releases renin. Now, when we get to the endocrine system, we'll learn about a couple of steps that go on there from renin. But right now, I want you to know that renin goes through a couple steps, and ultimately, we end up with a hormone called angiotensin 2. So, yep, there's an angiotensin 1. But angiotensin 2 is a big player here. And angiotensin 2 has 4 different ways that it can raise blood pressure. Let's look at that. So first, it's going to stimulate the secretion of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. It's going to stimulate the secretion of ADH from the hypothalamus or posterior pituitary gland. It is on its own going to cause systemic vasoconstriction. And it's also going to tell the hypothalamus to tell us that we're thirsty, because there's only 2 ways we can increase blood volume. We can take it out of the urine and put it back into the blood, or we can add more fluid through our diet. So this is really important. Angiotensin 2, 4 mechanisms. Triggers the secretion of aldosterone, triggers the secretion of ADH, systemic vasoconstriction, and tells the hypothalamus to increase thirst. Now, in each system, we're going to learn a little bit more details about this process, but this is a big deal. So we are going to see it in 5 other chapters besides chapter 26. So learn it now, don't memorize it, teach it to someone, practice writing the different steps, and so that you understand how it works in the multiple pathways to raise blood pressure. Because remember, if blood pressure drops too low, we don't get blood to the brain. When the brain stops working, we die. So maintaining adequate blood volume and blood pressure is essential to survival. Okay, so here is a little picture, if you like pictures more than words. Here's your kidney releasing renin. Now, we talked about angiotensin 2. So remember I said there's a couple other players. So the liver is going to play in there. The lungs are going to play in here for these other substances. But renin is going to trigger these reactions that are going to result in angiotensin 2 in the blood. Angiotensin 2 is a hormone. It travels through the blood to the hypothalamus, tells the hypothalamus to secrete ADH, tells the hypothalamus to tell us to drink. It's going to act on the smooth muscle in the blood vessels and tell them to constrict, which is going to decrease the volume of the blood vessel to increase the pressure of the blood in it. So that's important to know. Vasoconstriction does not affect blood volume, but it reduces the space that same volume can be in, which will increase blood pressure. And then angiotensin 2 is going to act. Here's your little adrenal gland, this little yellow cap on the kidney, is going to act on the adrenal gland to tell it to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to act in the kidney in order to reabsorb sodium and water. All of this functions to raise blood pressure. And here's a little bit more complex diagram that came from your textbook. Spend some time with this diagram so that you can reproduce it, or you could teach it to someone else. So here is the stimulus, systemic, drop in systemic blood pressure. That's going to cause some changes at the kidney level. Remember, at the receptors there. So we're going to notice that the filtrate, that's a pre-urine, is going to be more concentrated. And then the kidney will release renin. Renin is the enzyme that starts this whole reaction. Renin is going to function in the conversion of this angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 2 is what I want you to focus on this chapter. Angiotensin 2 has 4 mechanisms in order to raise blood pressure. It is going to cause systemic vasoconstriction in the arteries. Now look, that is going to raise blood pressure, not affect blood volume. Angiotensin 2 is going to act on the adrenal gland, tell it to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to talk to the kidneys and tell it to reabsorb sodium. Water will follow. That increases blood volume, right here, this pink box, as well as blood pressure. And then the 4th mechanism is over here. It's going to act on the posterior pituitary. Remember, that's that storage place for ADH. Hypothalamus makes ADH, stores it in posterior pituitary. It's going to, so angiotensin 2 is going to tell the posterior pituitary, release ADH. ADH acts on the kidneys, tells the kidney to reabsorb more water, only, no solute. The water increases blood volume, increase in blood volume, increases blood pressure. So there's a lot of information in this recording. So go through it a couple times, answer the study guide review questions, use it to answer your lab reports. If you don't understand it here, in your lab report, I've given you some link to some other videos. There's also a folder of additional study resources. So if you don't understand it here, go to your textbook and read, YouTube can be a fabulous place. Just make sure you're checking out good sources there, but find some other ways, diagrams or videos to watch so that you really understand how renin, angiotensin, aldosterone works and how ADH and aldosterone function to raise blood pressure. And then remember, we had that one other hormone, ANP, that is the only hormone that we have that reduces blood pressure.